Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod, and in this informative interview, I have the pleasure of speaking with Canna Consultants co-founder, Stephen Oliver. In this interview, we discuss Steve's background, the Canna Consultants and what they do, UK cannabis industry, international cannabis industry, the separation between medical and adult use cannabis, novel foods, and potential unethical business practices in the cannabis industry. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon, where you could help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Steve, thank you so much for joining me on the channel.
Yeah, brilliant. Lovely to be on with you, Connor. I'm a fan of the cartoons, and hopefully we get an opportunity to talk about those as well.
Very much look forward to it, very much so. So, I mean, just for people that are unaware of yourself or what it is you do, like, what is your background? How did you get into the cannabis industry, and what is the Canna Consultants?
Okay. Well, I've actually been around cannabis probably since about 1984. And my relationship with cannabis has been through many iterations. So, in the 80s, big reggae fan, a lot of us used to smoke cannabis. And I've got no shame in saying that at all. And it was all recreational use. And then actually joined customs. So and I went on and became an investigator, and I worked undercover. So I worked on Class A drugs. But I can remember being, in the green lane when people would target Rastafarians and actively looking for personal use. So I was acutely aware at a very, very early age that the war on drugs, in whatever iteration, wasn't working. And as a result of that, in my sort of mid-20s, I left. It just wasn't for me. And we'll come back to the war of drugs, I'm sure, shortly. So then my career took a sort of turn. I studied law. I was very interested in environmental law and international sort of recycling laws, and I worked with a number of international companies who were trying to find their way around what they thought was a harmonized European Union, but in actual fact in those days consisted of 22, 23, then 24 different sets of laws. I came back to cannabis when my mother was terminally ill with Alzheimer's, and there was a stage around about sort of 12, 14 years ago when I don't know if you know a lot about Alzheimer's, which is a terrible disease, but my mother had lost all sense of identity and a memory, and essentially, a human being regresses to a baby, and they become frightened individuals, and she was on terrible. It's just a path to death, and one of the things she suffered from was she just had living nightmares the whole time. She didn't know who she was or who anybody was, and she was just scared. She would repeat these words, and she suffered from what's called bruxism, where you grind your teeth, and her teeth were grinding away. And I was talking to the doctors and trying to find a solution. The only solution they could offer was remove her teeth. They're just going to remove all of her teeth, pull them out. And I thought there's got to be more to this. So I did what everybody would do. I went onto the internet, and I came across cannabis as a medicine and cannabis oil. So it just didn't exist in the UK. It didn't exist in a medical. I wanted CBD. I wanted a highly concentrated CBD extract. It just wasn't available. So anyway, I got some of the oil from Holland, and I started rubbing it into my mum's lips, and it was miraculous. It didn't prevent her from dying, but it stopped that grinding. And I started looking at it more and more, and I thought, what is causing that? How is that happening? And I remembered Peter Tosh, and I went to my vinyl. I'm a big vinyl collector, and I pulled out Legalize It, and because I just wanted to listen to the list of benefits that cannabis gave you when he talks about tuberculosis, and I went through and I thought, and then I just went down this rabbit hole looking. I just thought, this crisis is a mess. And then around about sort of 2015, 16, CBD started emerging. You had Jacob Hoy and there were people starting to sell it. It was mostly really the vapes that sort of started up. And being interested in the law, I was looking at the regulatory framework, and there wasn't one. And it also it seemed to operate in this black hole. And I then started looking at the people that were so-called advisors at the time, and I thought, that's just bullshit. They were saying you could have 0.2% THC, and we'll go on to that later. But I just thought, this is wrong. And Matt's been a long-term friend of mine, Matt Lawson. He's a regulatory barrister, still practicing. And I said to Matt, look, Matt, look, you're the barrister here. Obviously, I'm an academic lawyer. This doesn't make sense to me. How about drafting an opinion on THC in a food? So he did, and Matt's quite sort of old school, and it took me about sort of 6 months by continually pointing things out to him to say, there's a real gap in the market here, Matt, because this industry is going through the roof. We could see what was happening in the States and the mistakes they'd made. So we both did our own sort of bit of traveling. We were both speaking to people who were involved in the industry and people at a regulatory level who were trying to find a way of controlling the industry or seeing where it would pitch. And over a beer, I managed to convince him. I said, let's give it a go. Let's try and create a business. And what the initial idea was that we would create this sort of bat phone, this red telephone, whereby companies would pay us almost like as an insurance policy. And when there was a problem with trading standards or with the police or so, they could call us and we would try and help. But there wasn't any enforcement, so there was no need. Well, we had a bat phone, it just didn't ring. But then we found that people were coming to us and asking for sort of honest advice, and there were a lot of companies that wanted to be compliant, and this was predominantly in the CBD industry. But then we got involved with my passion, and also Matt's now was medicinal cannabis in children. We got involved with Charlotte Caldwell, and she'd been very badly let down with her son Billy, who changed the law. Very badly let down by people. They saw her as a sort of a poster girl, and because she was so desperate, she won't mind me saying this, she'd do anything for her son, as any parent would. She was, I would go as far as to say she was actually being abused by certain individuals in the industry. So then we started to dig down and look at that, and it was clear that the North American, the Canadian models weren't working. But there were lots of countries that were looking at trying to put a structure in place. And we set about with a framework. And at that stage, we drafted a pathway for the FSA as how they could try and bring the CBD industry into compliance without destroying it. And we were also speaking to the Greek government at that stage and the Maltese government. And we went to a conference in Malta, and before regime change there, they were very, very keen to sort of drive this forward in Europe. So we were drafting advice on how you could fill this void and create a legitimate business and attract investment and prevent consumer detriment. And the Isle of Man were looking at creating a lawful medicinal cannabis export industry, and we got the gig to draft all the legislation. And then we've been to Armenia, and Armenia we're looking at it. We've worked a little bit in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, and the business just grew. So we've got an office in Greece now. We've got an office in New York, our office in London, and really we deal with cannabis. We don't deal with recreational cannabis, and we don't do that because of proceeds of crime. And we deal with CBD industry and medicinal cannabis. And I would say the CBD industry is easy to categorize. It's someone that's attempting to or selling a food supplement or a topical that contains cannabinoids. The medicinal industry is far more difficult to categorize. I think there are 3 categories of medicinal cannabis, and I think the lack of understanding and the lack of partitioning of all these different streams leads to the problem that we have now and the stasis. And if I'm quite honest, I don't think I read all of these articles about it's 5 billion, it's going to be worth this and that. I don't see that. I see companies hemorrhaging money. I see investment drying up now, and I see a real lack of transparency and a real lack of certainty. And what you need in business are those 2. You need to know what you need to do, and then you can have a choice as to whether you do it or not. And you need certainty with regard to a legal framework so that you can capitalize, you can build, and you can expand. And I think what we're trying to do now, what I'm trying to do now, is try and have an honest approach and try and develop solutions, and that's solutions for individuals, corporations, and governments. So that's what we do. We've got some great staff. We've got a number of lawyers that work with us, because this from our perspective, it's understanding regulation, understanding how you can transport these goods, what you can do, where you can get licenses for, whether you're talking about medicinal cultivation, whether you're talking about product development, whether you're talking about CBD. The legal framework is is paramount. There are so many peddlers of myths, you know. I remember once when my son came home and he was in trouble with the RE teacher, and I just said, "I'll tell her she's a peddler of myths," and he did. But that's another story. But I think the problem we've got is we've got so many so-called experts, and to get fees, you often tell people what they want to hear. And we all like our homework to have been marked by our mum, because it doesn't matter how bad it is, she tells us it's fantastic. And there's so much of that going on. And we've got a great lawyer in Scandinavia that works with us. We've got 2 lawyers in Greece. We've just been doing some work with the Thai government, because despite the fact you've got all of these companies racing there, it's in an absolute mess. I mean, I was lucky enough in November to sit down with the Thai Minister for Health and the Thai Minister in charge of traditional medicines, because the Thais have got a 600-year history of using cannabis as a traditional medicine, but they're so far advanced in their knowledge that they wouldn't. An example is people were using CBD with regard to diabetes, and what they said was, actually, you can't do that because the sugar will just crashes. You need to mix it with this herb. But I'd never heard of this herb. And then we're having a conversation about this, which is Andrographis paniculata, and this is a Thai herb. During the middle of COVID, in the Thai prisons, all of the prisoners were given this supplement, and they didn't have a COVID epidemic in the prisons, and they've been using this herb for hundreds of years for colds and influenza. So anyway, I tend to drift off, Connor. I apologise. So I'm sitting down having a conversation, and they're saying, what do we do at the moment? Because we've legalised cannabis. We've got no actual. We don't have the ability to distinguish between cannabis and hemp, and that's a false construct anyway. But they've gone indica's one, sativa's the other, and now we've given away these plants, and we've got a huge lobby against that because we're not protecting vulnerable groups and children. We said, so what's the problem? They said, well, people are growing at home. They're growing plants. So we said, well, why don't you enact a law which says if anybody's got children under the age of 18, they're not allowed to have self-cultivation. So we have anecdotal conversations, we have official engagements, and my personal desire is that in the next 12 months, we can get to a position where people that are interested in being involved in the cannabis industry, whether that be because they like smoking it, because they like getting high, or whether, perhaps more importantly, it's saving the life of their child, are able to do so, and they can do so in an environment where it's safe and consistent and reliable.
That sounds really exciting, Stephen. Let's say a couple of points. Don't apologise. Please go on at length about this. Nobody wants to hear me speaking. I have nothing to contribute in that sense. But that's really exciting. So there's a lot to unpack there. Just starting in the UK, the Isle of Man, a lot of people won't understand or be aware of the circumstances going on in the Isle of Man. So could you describe essentially what is the framework that's going on there? What stage of development are they at? And secondary to that, you mentioned that there's 3 compartments to medical cannabis. Can you just touch on that afterwards?
Yeah, we'll go there. I mean, I think the Isle of Man suffers from the problems that everybody does. And let's take mainland UK. So you've got the Misuse of Drugs Act. Cannabis is a controlled drug. So the only exemptions for that are research or for medicinal use. So if you and I wanted to start cultivating cannabis indoors to export to Germany, let's say, or to fuel the private prescription market in the UK, there are barriers. There's what's called the chicken and egg problem. So the Home Office won't allow you permission to cultivate, so won't grant you a cultivation license until you can demonstrate it's a medicine. And to be a medicine, you have to achieve what's called GMP certification. So you have to show that you will deal with this product at a pharmaceutical standard. That's governed by the MHRA, so the Medicines Health Regulatory Authority. So you've got 2 very powerful regulatory bodies in the UK, Home Office and MHRA. One has one half of the permission, the other has the other. You can't get this one unless you've got this one, and you can't get this one unless you've got this one. So we were stuck in this continuous circle. So what had to happen was there had to be a facility whereby you were allowed to grow a little bit, because you had to have some cannabis to put into this GMP area. And whilst it's a plant, and we will go off on a tangent because there's a lot of people saying cannabis is medicinal, but you can't have your cake and eat it. If you want to say cannabis is a medicine, what are you saying? We're going to have a whole new rules about medicine just for cannabis? No, we've got long established rules for medicinal products, whether that's pharmaceutical or specials in this country, and cannabis has to align with those. And what that means is At the point at which you cultivate the plant, and that's governed by GCHP, so you've got practices for the cultivation, which will look at, making sure it's not full of nasty things at the end of it. But you then have an area in a cultivation facility which turns into exactly the same area as if you were making Nurofen or paracetamol. It's a pharmaceutical clean room route, and we have to separate people, plants, and products. So the point that you harvest that plant, when it goes into the room to be trimmed before it's dried, you move into a sterile production environment. So you need an element of cannabis to go in there so that you can have a turnkey solution and demonstrate to the MHRA that you can produce a consistent product at the end that would be essentially certified by them. Now, whether that's a strain of flower, whether that's an oil, it needs that certification. Once you've got that, the Home Office will grant you the license to cultivate, and then away you go. Now, that can take 5 years. So we had GW that were growing at formerly GW, growing Tate & Lyle, happily growing their skunk for their contribution to the UK as being the highest exporter of medicinal cannabis. And anyway, let's not go there.
There'll be lots of subscribers cheering right now, Steve.
Maybe we'll come back. But you've got a company that's just recently been very successful with that. I mean, Celadon. So it took them millions and millions of pounds, and it's taken them years and years and years to get to that position. So there are real barriers to entry. So the Isle of Man, Jersey, Northern Macedonia, other jurisdictions wanted to try and find a way that they could offer a haven for people who had that investment, because it creates jobs, it provides education, and more importantly, I think young people, it's an exciting career, and it stops young people migrating from or emigrating from these sort of disparate parts of the Crown dependencies. So the Isle of Man saw this as a solution. Unfortunately, as a Crown dependency, the Home Office are in overall control, the arbiters, and they control the airspace. And there are a lot of issues with regards to that being a finished route to market, let's say, Connor. We can maybe come back and talk about this as another day, but I get the distinct impression that the British government doesn't want these upstarts, whether that be Jersey, Guernsey, the Ballywhack, whether that be the Isle of Man. They really like to get their house in order before that happens. And we've seen that with CBD in Jersey, because Jersey created its own legislation which allowed for a higher ratio of THC in a product. Great, allowed to do that. The Home Office said that's fine, but none of that's coming into the UK. And we then have other issues in these jurisdictions, because cannabis cultivation is highly energy intensive. And I often laugh, especially 420 at Hyde Park, when you see people, and I've been there, and they preach to me about sustainability and the environment. And I point out, do you know how much energy went into making that joint that you're smoking? And do you know how much energy is going into your TikTok videos that you now give you? So don't give me a hard time because I'm in my 50s. That's not all my bloody fault. But it is very energy intensive, and some of the grids that exist just don't have the capacity for that. And is it a priority to give that energy to housing? You then look at the fact we've got these data centres that are using equivalent amounts of electricity, and nobody seems to mind them being there. So there are problems, and that's made other jurisdictions more attractive, because ultimately we're talking about commodity here, and if we talk about flower, it's done about price per gram. And we can see in Northern Macedonia that you can produce a gram high quality cannabis flower, consistent indoor, for about 30 cents. In the UK, I think you're probably talking about 70 pence. That can only have gone up with the energy increase in price. But Northern Macedonia is a grey area. So from a banking perspective, it's got problems. Morocco is now opening up the cannabis industry, but it's based in 3 provinces in the north, which are traditionally where all of the hashish and narcotics come from. And what they want to do is create sort of sustainable farming. And I suppose take the failed model in Afghanistan, where we give somebody a different crop that's going to generate income as opposed to the heroin poppy. Slightly easier in Morocco, but that's outdoor cultivation, and it may move to indoor cultivation in a year or two at the earliest, but you just cannot produce a consistent flower outdoors that is going to meet the standards for GMP. You just can't do it. The plant wants to grow in different ways. So that will be the source of extraction material. So I think I see Morocco has been quite an emerging part of the world. Greece, great climate, supplemental lighting, so greenhouses with shutters where you can use LEDs. The problem there is they've got such a strong Orthodox Christian political element, which is so prohibitive towards drugs. And it's interesting, you know, we hear you hear about these sort of restrictive religions. I'm seeing sort of, you know, Islamic faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism in those various countries, sort of Thailand, India, and Morocco, North American cities and countries where they don't have that prohibitive approach, because they've got respect, because for hundreds, if not thousands of years, they've recognized the medicinal qualities. So the preconceived ideas, the Western world has got a lot to learn from other people. I think you asked me about the 3 different types of medical, didn't you? So
Yeah, that's right.
Most people would say that there's 2. So you've got pharmaceutical medical, and we've had that for a long time. So we've got Sativex, which is, you know, 1 part THC to 1 part CBD. We've got Marinol, American trademark. That's a highly concentrated THC extract, at least 97%, and that's been used for AIDS patients for many years. And also we're looking at medicines that can be used for chemotherapy. We've got medicines to be used for multiple spasticity and multiple sclerosis. So we've got a good track record. And then we look at Epidiolex, and Epidiolex is isolated CBD. I'm going to try and talk about that without getting into the supplemental market at the moment. We'll come back to the conspiracies, which are not conspiracies, but we've got a 98% CBD isolate with a bit of strawberry flavouring in it, basically. And the efficacy for that is interesting, because if you look at the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, a registration, there's a form for every single medicine. So if you look up ibuprofen, or you look up paracetamol, you've got the authorization for the drug, active ingredient, it tells you what the active ingredient is, and it tells you why it works. If you look at Epidiolex, it says unknown. So even the pharmaceutical registration says we know what it is, but we don't know why it works. We don't know how it works, and that's very strange that a company could achieve that. Now, I'm not saying it's bad that they've achieved that, but I'm just saying it's strange. So we've got that medicinal side, and we know that a lot of companies are now looking at other applications, so increased bioavailability, targeting, and really looking at what applications there are. So we know CBD is anti-inflammatory. I think that goes without saying. CBG may have some kind of antibiotic properties. We know that the isomers. We've got so many different. When people talk about controlled cannabinoids and THC, in the UK there are actually 12 controlled cannabinoids. We can only actually test for 5 or 6. Some people can test for 6, but when you look at it, THC is a category, and CBN. So we know pharmaceutical companies are looking at those, and they're looking at them from a whole range of reasons. But if we're honest about this, pharmaceutical companies don't like curing people, because it's really bad for business. What you want to do is you want to keep somebody ill, but you want to keep them alive for as long as possible, and you want them to have a realizable benefit from that drug, because that's where you make your money. And also it costs millions. So I think conservative estimate for Epidiolex is probably somewhere in the region of $500 million. You want to protect that. So that's one side of the industry. And there are opportunities there for people, because a lot of the models, you can look at the tobacco models. So all the big tobacco companies, Philip Morris, VAT, they used to grow their tobacco, they used to grow it, third world countries, and then they make the cigarettes that we smoke. I still smoke. But they tend not to do that now. So the tobacco is an ingredient. So they buy in, and they're more of a R&D manufacturing. And the pharmaceutical companies are a bit like that, because if you're a Pfizer or a Bosch, you'll have some R&D, but growing cannabis is not easy. It's not like putting some tomatoes up in the greenhouse, to get it. So I think that there's a real revenue stream there for buying in that raw ingredient. So that's one medical. We've done that. And we can come back to how it's trying to protect its commercial interests if you want to. The second category is this catch-all that I hear people talking about, which is self-medication. And that really came about, and we have to talk about Charlotte Caldwell and Billy again. That came about in this country with the change in law where you're actually allowed to have what's called a special. So there extenuating circumstances meant that you could provide this cannabis would move from being a Schedule 1 drug, and at the stroke of a pen in a prescription, it would move across into a different pathway, and then it could be prescribed by a consultant. And there are certain criteria there. So it's a drug of last resort. You have to have exhausted all the pharmaceutical opportunities, and it can only be prescribed by a consultant. So your GP doesn't have access to this. The fact that it's still not routinely taught in medical school, and the endocannabinoid system just seems to be left to one side, that's a tale for the riverside. But coming back to my point, you've got this strange situation where that change in law, which was really to allow for very, very seriously ill people who had proven that cannabis in whichever form, whether that be in some instances vaping, but more often not in a combination of whole plant oils, which the parents themselves would then have to dilute and dose, could actually prevent death where pharmaceutical drugs had failed to do so. So I think the government, when they were doing that, it was a bold move. But unfortunately, what it did was it opened up what I call the tits, teeth, and bud industry. So we've got this area of the high street now where you can go and have cosmetic enhancements, have your teeth whitened, and you can also then go and get a cannabis prescription. So it's created a two-tier system, and it's created a system where if you've got sufficient money, you can legitimize your recreational drug use. And I don't care what anybody says. When I was 15, 16, and 17, not one of my friends was self-medicating. And that's despite being told by all the music that we listened to that it was good for tuberculosis and asthma. We like getting stoned. Something happened in the last 10 years, and I just can't put my finger on it, but if you talk to people honestly, I think 1 in 10 people is self-medicating. The other 9 like that term self-medication, but that's a fact. They're getting stoned. And what that means is if you've got 200-300 quid or more a month, you get a prescription. And that's not in any way denigrating the people that actually are using this as a medicine, because there are, a lot of people. If you look at the figures, I don't know, what is it? 1.3 million regularly using cannabis. 100,000 of them, let's say, 150,000 are using that to medicate. That's a huge amount of people. But the majority of them aren't. And what that's done is that stigmatizes the people that can't afford to do that. So we're creating this tier system. And I've got to come on to the war on drugs here, because the war on drugs has failed, but it's the situation that it's created that is the problem. And it's the fact that all of our cannabis consumption, with the exception of a very small amount, is controlled by organised crime. And I hear these arguments, it's not a gateway drug. It is a bloody gateway drug. I mean, unless something's fundamentally changed. When I was 17 years of age, the same person that was supplying cannabis was giving you a wrap of whiz, or you'd get your E off them. We didn't have a block of 4 doors, and one was Class A and Class B. And some people chose to do it, some people didn't. So, and it annoys me when they say, it's as bad as alcohol. No one's ever won a legal argument by saying, well, look at that person, they're going faster than me. It doesn't work. It's not retrospective. Of course we wouldn't have alcohol. If we jump to novel foods, if you and I invented sugar, we would never get past the validation stage. It's just poison. So there's no point having these sort of spurious arguments. And we have to admit that cannabis, the sale of cannabis on the black market has an exceptionally negative effect socially, economically, and with county lines and with various other things. There's a damaging element. That sounds like I'm a Daily Mail reader. That, to me, I turn that round. That's the reason why we need legalization, because we need to prevent that social harm. And that's where I think that you need 3 categories of medicinal cannabis, because I think the government and the naysayers and the people that still believe in reefer madness won't accept that medicinal use. So I think you've got pharmaceutical, I think you've got the children, and I think you've got the adults that really need this and can show and can provide an accurate evidence case that I have tried this tablet, I have tried this drug, I've tried all of these drugs, cannabis works, and it does. But we don't know how, Connor. We don't know why. And what sometimes keeps me awake at night is the fact that whenever I've seen adult recreational use succeed, all of the money for research, development, clinical trials just evaporates because everybody immediately pivots and they pivot towards where the money is, and there's no criticism there. So I think we need to be honest, and I'll give you my ideas on how we can solve this problem in a moment. But I think we need to be honest that pharmaceutical drugs have established that through clinical trials the safety and the efficacy of these drugs. So we leave them. They're not in our argument. They don't want to be part of our world. So there's no point as criticising them all of the time, because that criticism isn't a positive or constructive argument to have the change we need. I think we also need to identify that somebody in their 20s who enjoys smoking cannabis for maybe not that much different to somebody who has an emotional crutch that they use alcohol for. So that has to have 2 glasses of wine at night or a beer because it helps them sleep. We know it doesn't. I'm sure cannabis doesn't in some instances, but I think we've got to be honest. So we've got this area of medicinal cannabis where we are crying out for more research to understand, so we can get to a point where we can say, right, I've got isolated CBG, isolated CBD, isolated THC. You need 3 to 2 to 1. Mm-hmm. Then we come on to the issue of legalization of cannabis. Whether you want to smoke it to relax, whether you want to smoke it socially, or whether you're using it as an emotional crutch, or whether you're using it for anxiety, whether you're using it for all forms of legitimate disease and ailments. And that's where the problem is, because we've got a lot of shouty voices, and when you listen to the noise, it's all criticism. It's all, well, if they can do that, why can't I do this? And the war on drugs is wrong. I don't see any benefit of us talking about Nixon at the moment, or the way we treated the Mexicans. I don't get it. It doesn't help. Mm. What we can do is we can look at the facts, and we are being led a merry dance by our politicians at the moment, and also by some industry groups and lobbyists. And that merry dance is very disturbing to me. And we can look at Germany. So Merkel's government fell to a coalition, and a lot of that vote winning was on that 18 to 25 to 30 category, where they said we're going to legalize cannabis. So it was a vote winner. Same thing's happening in Thailand at the moment with the upcoming election with the Newton in June. So it's a vote winner. But we know in this country, what politicians tell you and what's on a manifesto doesn't necessarily manifest itself into what they actually do. Nick Clegg springs to mind. Student fees, sold his soul to the devil to have a coalition. And I'm not getting political here. Well, I am, but so the Germans, we're going to legalise cannabis. They know they can't. They can't do it. And they can't do it for 2 reasons. First is they don't understand the mechanism. The second is they're disingenuous. So they've got 2 ceilings. They've got the European Union. And the European Union is a collection of 27 individuals, and they've all got to agree, because the fundamental principles are free movement of goods. So if I'm your neighbour and you don't, and something's unlawful and I want to legalise it, then you've got every right to veto that and stop it happening. Mm-hmm. So they've got that issue, and then they've got the UN Convention, the 61 Convention, which again is a nonsense. And Germany is not prohibited by the European Commission from legalising cannabis. But the way they're going about it, and the way the Czech Republic are going about it, what we're going to do is we're going to end up with decriminalisation. And again, when I talk to people don't fundamentally understand the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. Decriminalisation is bad. Decriminalisation means that all of the laws remain in effect. It's just the state doesn't choose to enforce them at that juncture, at that moment. So decriminalisation, you can walk down the road, you can smoke a joint. You can't smoke it outside the primary school. You can do what you want in your house. That doesn't help legitimate business. It doesn't allow you to, it's still unlawful. So you can't get a bank account for your business. You can't get the premises for your business. You can't get the lease for your business. You can't invest. You can't get investment. So decriminalisation doesn't help. What's worse than that is, I think, the whole justification for a change in attitude towards drugs and their legalisation, and let's just keep it on cannabis at the moment, though, is because of the human rights element, because of social harm. I'm going to read you this, Connor, and I hate bloody reading stuff, but everyone keeps going on about the UN, yeah?
Yeah.
So, right. This is the reason, if you look at the United Nations, go on the website, this is the reason it was formed for. Maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, and promoting social progress, better living standards and human rights. And the maintenance of human rights are paramount to any other international law. So when we're looking at social progress, better living standards and human rights, the very aims that the convention seeks to promote are being eroded by this continued adherence to the unlawful use of cannabis. So what we should be doing is demonstrating how decriminalisation will further the black market. Now, I had some interesting conversations in the room when I was fortunate enough to meet you in Edinburgh. It was a great day, but I had people saying, "What's wrong with decriminalisation? We can grow 3 plants." I mean, give me a break. If there's 1.3 million cannabis users, yeah, how many of those are going to grow 3 cannabis plants?
Probably hardly any.
Well, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Where are you going to get the seeds from? Oh, we're going to decriminalise cannabis, but we'll change the law so that seeds are no longer as souvenirs. That you can actually have a category. It just doesn't make sense. And if we do that, I'd imagine burglaries will go through the roof. You're still going to buy from the black market. By the time you bought a grow tent, unless you're going to put them on the windowsill for your neighbour to wait until they're nice and then smash your window. If you're going to buy a grow tent and the lights and your electricity bill, bloody hell, you just go and buy a quarter.
Yeah.
The black market is given a free pass, and all of the harm is still there. So legalisation, the argument should be that the benefits of legalisation are freedom of choice. And let's be honest, in the majority of places now, whether there's a majority in favour of legalisation or a minority, always the majority is in favour of allowing people to have freedom of choice. And what we need to do is we need to be honest about the harm that allowing the black market to control drugs is doing, rather than ignoring that and trying to shine the light on alcohol or saying it's not the same as other drugs. We need to be honest about that and show how we can alleviate that and bring people out of that those social environments where there's so much crime, threats, poverty, and yeah, alcohol is horrendous. But we're not talking about alcohol. And I think if we can get to that position where we're being brutally honest with each other, then we can not make the mistake that the North Americans have made. Because I also see this argument, think of the tax. God, the reason the American model, the Canadians failed, the reason Tilray, Hexo, and they're all going down the pan. I mean, look at the figures. They're losing billions. We've got 5 billion loss on 1.9 on Hexo. They're going into insolvency, these companies. The reason is because legal weed, well, it's 2 reasons. Legal weed is cheaper. Legal weed is more expensive than illegal weed. So all the time, illegal weed is cheaper because of the tax. You've got to convince somebody that buy this more expensive product. Now, most people smoking cannabis have been using the same dealer for a protracted period of time, maybe 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
Consistency and quality is really good. So if you tax cannabis, if you tax it to extreme, that doesn't promote a legal industry. So there's so many layers to this onion. Yet I think people are reluctant to have those conversations. And there are solutions. Bolivia, Uruguay, Canada, they've all got around the convention in one way or another. Just imagine for a moment if you had a country that was part of the European Union that had left recently in the last 2 years, was free of those shackles, then all they would have to do is present the human rights argument to the United Nations, and there you go. We could have legalised recreational use in the UK, controlled by the government, with a stipulation that an element of that tax went into clinical trials to try and protect that group that I highlighted, where we've got children and people with real needs.
Yeah. So, I mean, like model-wise then, a lot of people will think, well, legalisation, if hypothetically, take away the narrative, take away any form of rhetoric, debate back and forward, we're in a position where legalisation has arrived. Who's it that takes the reins then? What's the model that follows after that? Okay,
well, that's where it's difficult. And I think this is already happening. So we're seeing cannabis cultivation units being set up, and I'm not going to name any names, but look at brand names. So look at brand names of these companies, and you can see that doesn't smack me of being a medicinal type name. And what they're doing is, I think they're perfecting their craft, making some revenue from the private prescription, because they're going to gear towards recreational use. So the danger that we have is, we have that American style model where only those with sufficient capital at the moment can actually provide the supply for that demand, which will inevitably happen. Because what you've got to do is you've got to diminish the black market supply by offering a supply of. It can be more expensive because you're happy going into a shop, but it can't be significantly more expensive, and it has to be the same or better quality. So the answer is who's going to do it. I would suggest that upon legalization, you will have two separate routes to market. So you'll have those people that truly want to be in the medicinal market that are going to follow GMP and the pharmaceutical processes to produce a product that could be prescribed. Mm-hmm. And then you have other people that are able to cultivate, and providing they prevent, theft and hemorrhaging, have the same level of security, then, because I suspect that it would then become like a food, wouldn't it, rather than a medicine or it's a recreational good. The standard would be less. So we'd say, as part of this license, you've got to show that it's safe. I mean, safe if something you smoke is a bit of an oxymoron, but free of heavy metals and contaminants. Mm. But I don't think you'd necessarily need to have a £2 million unit where it was produced and passed through the walls, at a pharmaceutical level. So I think you can have the two. Right. But there's a time period, and that's what Germany found, was when Germany, slightly different, when they allowed prescription by GPs, the demand went through the roof. I think they thought they'd have 10,000 prescriptions, and they had 90,000 people running down the corridors. So they had to import. So there needs to be some forward thinking. But this is not an easy problem to solve. There are solutions, but you point out that the biggest problem, I think, is when you've sold everything else, who's going to supply that cannabis in the absence of the black market? Well, it's not going to be individuals. So it has to be companies. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is, from my knowledge of the industry, there are a lot of very, very high net worth individuals sitting outside of the industry at the moment, waiting for that to happen. And boy, will they get the ganja up and growing pretty damn quickly when the opportunity is there for them to do it legally. So I think we'll have a lead-in period, and then places like the Isle of Man and Jersey and Guernsey, maybe Cornwall and Scotland, they'll develop sort of trust. Mm-hmm. So we'll have these artisan products and these heirlooms. And you look at, Landrace Warden, and you look at the work that people like Carl Epstein are doing. There is a real desire to go back. There is with everything, isn't there? It's retro clothing, vinyl, you name it. There's a desire to track back from these crazy American strains that were developed. So I think the industry will develop, but the fact that we haven't got all of the answers at the moment shouldn't stop us from trying to change things. And I think the black market is exceptionally damaging. I think the dishonesty amongst people that use cannabis, not necessarily intentionally, but I think a lot of people have been caught up in this. I think if we had far more people saying, you know what, I just like smoking cannabis, that has a lot more weight to it. If I drink a bottle of whiskey, I'm awful with my family. If I go out in the garden and smoke a joint, I'm still a good dad. Mm-hmm. That to me has got a lot of weight. That's a good argument. But
I was going to say, you touched on that there, Kyle and Landrace Warden. I feel the same thing, because very often when you see it on Instagram, sorry, the Instagram feed, it's just nothing but plastic that you're looking at. All these shiny colours, there's this, and this. It's essentially the same product packaged differently. It's all essentially been hyper fucking produced since the end of the 90s. And I think that's where there's a real, not just nostalgia element, but increase in quality by going backwards to genetics, which have been long standing for centuries.
But where do you do that at the moment? Yeah. You have to go further afield, and you probably have to give up your IP, and you have to give up your secrets to somebody that's going to give you that cuckoo's nest to perfect your trade. So that's another thing we can do. But I think we're being misled by politicians who are allowing votes to be won by giving people false promises. Mm-hmm. Decriminalisation frightens the hell out of me, because it doesn't solve the problem. Yeah. And allowing, of course, I go to these meetings, and there are people there that could grow 3 fantastic plants 4 times a year. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it'll be the best cannabis ever, but they are not representative. But they're the voice, aren't they? Yeah. And you can be shouted down, and you don't have to be a cannabis user to want legalization.
Yeah.
You don't have to be convinced by the medicinal qualities to believe that another person has the right to choose what they put into their body. And I think we have sufficient data to show that when it's taken out of the hands of the black market, A&E is not full of people that have overdosed on a joint, you know.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting when you talk about the separation between medical and recreational, because I understand completely. So obviously, I think everybody's like, it's all cannabis use is medical, and I think it's just on the basis of that all cannabinoids interact with your endocannabinoid system. I think that's what they're trying to talk about. That just that all cannabinoids have a stimulus effect to your endocannabinoid system. Therefore, that relationship is medical, and I think that's what's interesting is that as evolution goes on with the cannabis industry, with the people that consume cannabis, inevitably that'll have to be concentrated in a way that is better understood.
I hear it in the CBD industry where people say CBD is not, it's not psychoactive. Of course it bloody is. You're marketing it changes the way someone feels. Isn't that the very definition of that? What you mean is it's very difficult. It's psychotropic. I mean, look, it doesn't get you high.
Yeah.
Maybe it does, a little bit. It certainly.
Thing is, I had an interview with somebody. They said the same thing. They were like, "Oh, it's not psychoactive." I was like, "I'm sure if you had like a fucking sandwich of CBD, you'd be feeling a done. You'd be feeling something." But perfect. You would talk about CBD there, actually, Steve. So Novel Foods fiasco in the past couple of years. What stage is it at? And recently, I think it was because I read. I think it was on your website about the European Industrial Hemp Association when they had a inconsistency in the description of toxicology. Is that relevant to the UK Novel Foods as well?
Yeah, I mean it is. This is the time I'd say let's take a break. I mean, what's wrong with it? Where is it at the moment? Yeah, I mean it has been a fiasco. The blame's not just with the regulators, but I have to say it is now. So I'm sure everybody listening understands, but basically we have a situation where we got this fantastic piece of European legislation which said that if you can't prove that a food was widely used before 1997. Either here or a traditional use in the third, in another country, then it has to go through this safety process. And the safety process is onerous, and the assumption is that something's dangerous. So what we're going to do is we have to take something like CBD, or chia seeds, or ultraviolet baked bread, or an extract of Arctic krill, or an artificial sort of B12. You take these new innovative foods, whether that be insects or not, and you demonstrate that it's safe. And it's a long process. Chia seeds took 5 years. Most novel foods take at least 3 years. So there was all these arguments that CBD had been used, and it hadn't really, because we hadn't isolated it. And what really makes it difficult is we're talking about cannabis. So none of the other foods that I mentioned there have a controlled element in them. So whether we like it or not, CBD doesn't matter how well you remediate and how well you remove the controlled cannabinoids, they are present, and they're present in the raw material that's used to make these products. So we've got the Misuse of Drugs Act, which means that there should be narcotics. And what should have happened at the very start was the Home Office, who were the department that determined whether or not something is a narcotic, should have said, look, if you've got a consumer product, here's a line, and this line is 0.000% THC and CBN. And more than that, they need to define which of these controlled cannabinoids and how you test for them. If it's below that, it's a food. If it's above that, it's a narcotic. Great. Pass the ball to the Food Standards Agency. First thing is prove that your product qualifies as a food, and then you can go through this process. Problem that we've got is that definition hasn't been made. So we've got a very well-established industry. There are products being made in this country, but none of them are being made lawfully, because you can't actually get a license to handle the ingredients. So we've got this crazy situation where you've got people throwing huge amounts of money to become compliant, so to test the products. And this is all about consumer detriment. And what the Food Standards Agency is tasked from their parent act, the Food Act, is to make sure that people don't market products that could be harmful. So you throw all of this money, and we've got all these unneeded rodent tests, and we're now stuck in this sort of twilight zone where the FSA can't actually progress anything until the Home Office decides where the cutoff point is. Now, before Brexit, we were all sitting down, we were part of the table. They were about to introduce what was called an acceptable contaminant level. So as I'm sure you're aware, cattle dairy cattle have fed on hemp, and when you test milk, there's very low levels of THC in it. So they were going to find a permitted level, and we know where we can pitch that level. Could be a lot higher than the government eventually will, but at the moment it's zero. And because it's zero, it's impossible for us without British Standard Institute's standards for testing. So we have what's called level of detection and level of quantification. So that essentially means how hard you look for the cannabinoids. And these machines aren't magic. So what you need to do with the machine is you get a tiny little bit of delta 8, delta 9, you put it in and you go learn that. And this is what you look for. And they break down the cannabinoids and they sort of fire out this shower. And if you imagine, delta 9 is a triangle, delta 8 is a star, and then CBD is a slightly different shape than the CBDA. And it counts them all really quickly. And that's how they test it. But different speeds of testing give different results. So we've got all these products that say not detected for THC. What they should say is not bloody looked for, because they didn't even, they haven't got the ability to find it. So we're stuck. Now, slightly different, because we left, the FSA were keen not to destroy the industry. So I honestly do believe that within there, they're a little bit stuck. It's not a priority. They've got low staff numbers. They can't retain staff. They can't recruit staff. They're underfunded. And to be honest with you, when the call comes in and says a child's just in hospital because of an elf vape, or someone's, remote controlled car blew up on Christmas Eve and set fire to the house, training standards and various people and the FSA, when people are dying of sandwiches in hospitals, their focus is not on CBD. Neither is the police or the Home Office with the war in Ukraine and all the other problems that they've got. So nothing is happening. That's what's happening. Now, we know that you were asked with your ingredient to produce this, what's called a toxicology report, and it's called an OECD 408 study, and it's basically a 90-day study where you get a whole bunch of unfortunate little Wistar rats, and they're split into groups. They need to be adolescent, because you want them producing sperm and to be fertile, so you can see if the balls get smaller or if anything's going to happen to the fallopian tubes. So basically what you do is you force feed these rats. Some of them don't get CBD, some of them are force fed at different levels, and then at the end of 90 days you kill the vast majority of them and conduct a necropsy. You keep some alive for another 30 days, what's called the recovery, and then you kill them. It's wonderful, considering all these products are, vegan friendly, and all the way we've been forced to go down this route, It's mind-boggling. But anyway, in their infinite wisdom, our two great trade associations, at the time with the European Industrial Hemp Association and ACI, never questioned this, said, great, give us all your money and we'll kill the rats. Now, unfortunately, Aya's test wasn't very good, because what happens is, what you're looking for are what are called adverse events. So we know too much CBD will actually make the liver. I'll talk in sort of layman's terms. You get swelling in the liver, okay? Now, what we also know from decent trials is that you need a lot of that, and then without it recovers. So what you're doing is you're looking at these various elevations, and when you do the necropsy, you're looking at testes sides, you're looking at the lady parts of these poor rats, you're looking at their lungs, you're looking at all of their organs, and you're also looking at their behaviour during the trials. So whether they lose appetite, whether they get bigger, whether they get smaller, whether they get lethargic, and they're called adverse events. So what you do with these rats is, to do it properly, you need quite a lot of rats, lots of groups. So you'll have some on a crazy amount of CBD, and then you'll have various stages. And what you're looking for is what they call the no observed adverse effect level. And you achieve that by seeing where there were adverse effects and then where there weren't any, and then you apply a calculation to come down to a level. Now, what Aya clearly did is they didn't have enough groups. It was a badly designed study. So when they hit what would have been the no adverse effect level and had to come down, you would have parachutes. So they're like different floors. So if you imagine CANNAMAN falling through the floors, if there's 4 floors, he's probably going to stop at the second floor. They didn't have any ceilings for the poor bugger. So the Aya application just went bang right down to the bottom. And that's how we ended up with 17.5 milligrams.
Right.
Now, each novel food application should be considered in isolation. But you hand a bunch of suspicious regulators and people who may or may not be linked to pharmaceutical companies who really don't want you selling their medicine that's cost them £500 million and they get for £400 a prescription for £12.50 when it's identical with a COA, you can understand why that would be welcomed with open arms. So At the moment in the UK, the FSA will pass these validated applications. And validated means I prepare a dossier and I've got 100 topics I have to cover. So validation should be, you check, have you put information in that's sufficient for us to pass it to the scientists who will then crunch that data. That's not what they've been doing, by the way, but that will then go to risk assessment. And that's when they really start looking at this. The EFSA, so the European equivalent, they produced a report last June, and that was called Safety Concerns of Cannabidiol. And that was, I don't know, all I can say is whoever wrote that was smoking some seriously strong weed, because I don't follow it. Now, in their defence, there was a lack of research on CBD products, clinical trials, but we've now got loads because there were so many people conducting this research. I mean, there was one company 2 years ago that declared they were examining in 9 species. They were force feeding horses, monkeys, you name it. There's an American company that was doing their best to kill rhesus monkeys with THC in Florida, and they were giving them 1,500 milligrams of THC.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's elements of this industry. I can very, very happily report that all that happened was that the monkeys went to sleep for a long period of time and woke up very, very hungry.
Yeah, you know what's funny? There'll be lots of viewers watching this going, 1,500, I can handle that. It's a Friday night.
Yeah, but there's a tolerance there. But they were actually, what they were looking to do was try and find like a death level. So let's start with and then work backwards. So there's no ethics involved in this. So I have also produced that data to the European regulators, and the European regulators are saying, even with all this work that you had to do, so all of this toxicology, all of these rodents, we're not happy. And animal testing shouldn't be used for this. You know, it just, I don't get it. We don't use it in cosmetics. We've been reducing it for 10 years. There is, don't get me wrong, Connor, there is justification in medicines for animal testing, but not for CBD, or maybe for one trial there was. But so the EFSA have now come out and said, no, we need human data. And what they're asking you, I mean, you really need to look at this data, because what they're saying is there's diarrhea. So what we want to know is what's the cause of diarrhea. There are 2 or 3 actual potential causes of diarrhea. What you can't do with a human being in a trial is intentionally make them ill. That's kind of unlawful and unethical. Yeah. And they've got issues about drug interaction. So what they're potentially suggesting is we take people who've got a pre-existing medical condition who are on a pharmaceutical drug and see if we give them a load of CBD, if it's going to make them more poorly. So they've set these unobtainable, absolutely unobtainable from a legal perspective and from a moral and ethical perspective, unachievable goals. And I think it's petulance. I think the European Union did not like Britain going off and doing its own thing. And I'll say that again. I think the European Union didn't like Britain going off and doing its own thing. And what it did was it set that 70 milligrams per day. Yeah. And I think the EFSA will take their time, but I suspect later this year or next year, they'll say, no, we think it's 25 or 30. And to be honest, as an industry, we don't care. We don't care if it's 10, 25 or 30. As long as you can get a license, you can produce a product lawfully, as you and I know. If I've got a banging headache, it might say take 2 tablets, but I'm going to have 3 or 4 of them. Yeah. You know, you should only have 14 units a week. My wife will tell you that sometimes I exceed that, you know, on the Sauvignon blog. Consumers are going to make their own decisions, and people aren't stupid. But what we need is some decisions, and we need the Home Office to decide when it's a narcotic and when it's a food, and then the FSA can do their job. And we need the European Union to stop being stupid, because what all of this has done is CBD shops are everywhere. Products are still being sold. The very aim was to prevent consumer detriment. And I've said on a number of occasions, I don't think the detriment was from a toxicity perspective. I think the detriment was I paid 50 quid for 10% CBD and it had none in it. Or I'm paying for isolate and it's crap, or the distillate's rubbish, or I think I'm buying full spectrum and I'm buying isolate. It's mislabeled and it's been made in the bathtub and it's full of normal food law. It's full of bacteria and mycotoxins. Yeah. So they've done nothing to prevent that, nothing at all. And as I said, the police aren't interested, trading standards aren't interested. So one of my roles is I try and sell compliance. So I want a company to come to me and say, Steve, what do we do to be able to say, we've ticked every box. We're doing everything we can to protect the consumer. That costs money. Now, it costs money with laboratories for analysis. And 3 years on in this process, Connor, we're at a situation now where the company down there that did nothing, didn't spend the money, is still making a profit. The company that spent all that money hasn't received any benefit from whatsoever. And the least they could expect, having embarked on this journey, is that there would be some form of enforcement against those that didn't.
Yeah,
so
so for people that are unaware as well, it's hundreds of thousands of pounds we're talking about, and between these companies, you know.
It could be, yeah. Well, between them, it's millions. It's millions. So I think, said they spent somewhere in the region of £3 million.
Right.
And then you look at an individual company to produce a dossier, it's got to be £250,000.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, on a tangent, talk about sort of snake oil merchants, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know the history of snake oil, Connor?
No, I don't.
Okay. So in the 1850s, because this really works for the CBD industry. This is anecdotally spot on true, but fact checking. In around about the 1850s, when they were building the transcontinental railway in America, they shipped in about 200,000 Chinese immigrants, and they were on appalling contracts and treated appallingly. And they came over to build the railways, very physical work, and they brought with them a snake oil. And they brought lots of medicines, traditional medicines, but the snake oil was made with the Chinese water snake.
Right.
And it had very, very high levels of omega-3 acids, which had a fantastic anti-inflammatory property. So when they finished their shifts, they were rubbing this into their joints. And some of the cowboys and the other Americans that had moved to help with the railways started using this and thought, wow, this is incredible. And they wanted to replicate it. So there was a guy, and they called him the Rattlesnake King.
Right.
So he decided that what he'd do is he'd extract this oil from rattlesnakes. So he got the snake, cut it, put it in the water, then bottled this oil. And the problem with that is that, well, twofold. Firstly, the rattlesnake has about less than a third of the omega-3 acids that the Chinese water snake does. And the second thing was he didn't put any. So the bottles he was selling were full of mineral oil, peppers, chili, some terps.
Right.
And he was found out. And he'd made the equivalent of hundreds of thousands, and he got fined $20, which is the equivalent now of about $400.
Right.
So the same thing's happening now.
Yeah.
You start off with something that has got all this efficacy, that's been known for thousands of years, that works. Somebody else takes it, tries to get rich quick, misleads everybody, and then we've got this analogy where they're caught out and nothing's happening to them. So it's probably right to say that these are snake oil merchants, but not actually in the sense that we often discuss it.
So how do you see the rest of the year playing out? FSA, Home Office, is that just a continuous battle and it's going to be the same circumstance come December?
The Home Office were asked in Parliament 2 weeks ago whether or not they were any closer, because we have this what's called this intermediate body called the Advisory Committee for the Misuse of Drugs, which is headed by Kit Malthouse, and he'd been tasked with trying to solve this problem. And there was a report. Pardon me, a lot of people didn't agree with it, but there were some suggestions. The Home Office, 15 months later, have said they're still considering it. They have got so many issues, the Home Office, at the moment. CBD is not one for them.
Yeah.
Their position is it's zero, it's zero, it's zero. Now, the FSA could say, well, if it's going to be zero, they could define with a government laboratory how you quantify zero, and that would help. But they have their own problems. So I don't see any products getting authorised this year. I see a lot of CBD companies getting into trouble because, I mean, I don't mean trouble legally, I mean in financial trouble, because there's a huge amount of investment. So at the point at which they decided they were going to be compliant and go through the novel process, a lot of them needed funding. So there was funding investors, and they now need more money because the sales have dropped because of the number of companies, and we've come out of COVID, and the price has crashed. And they need more revenue, and it's not there because investors are saying, well, hang on, we put this money in before novel foods. We had a year when we heard nothing. Now we're in the second year, nothing's happening. So funding's drying up. And I think you could see those people that don't want the industry, you've got this natural war of attrition against it. And what happens? All the responsible companies end up disappearing nearly, virtually. And those that never had any intention of being compliant and don't have the consumer at heart, they end up remaining there, whether they're online or whether they're selling their products elsewhere. And unfortunately, most of these products are made abroad, and they're made abroad because there is no licensed activity in the UK to make them, and all the time that happens, there's no control. So we know. I mean, you could probably remember, but sorry, 6 years ago, you could pay $4,000 for a kilo of isolate.
Yeah,
I'm using isolate as an example.
mm-hmm.
Now the market's flooded with £300 kilos, and the reason that is a lot of this is Chinese very poorly produced isolates. The Chinese they've got a lawful licensed area where it's expensive with high quality, and then they've got northern provinces where they're chucking out all sorts of shit, and responsible companies that were charging £1,500 a kilo 2 years ago, no one's buying it now. So to remain competitive, what you have is you've got the extraction process, and then you go down and then you remediate. So you start introducing more of the expensive elements and energy zapping elements and use of chemicals to strip out the controlled cannabinoids. If you don't do that, then you save money. So what has actually happened by this is we've introduced ingredients that are full of the contaminants that we sought to eliminate. So there's been sort of a race to the bottom, and that has to affect consumers. And a responsible company cannot sell a CBD product at £10. You can't do it. So what we need is the consumer to have trust and recognise that there's a lot of love and a lot of work gone into that product, and then it has a value associated with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny because when it comes to cannabis, everybody's it's almost synonymous conspiracy stuff. So let's talk about some of that. So in the UK, as we mentioned on the phone before, when I was writing that book, one of the things that seemed to be relatively apparent was that there was almost like a forethought of private clinics that would directly benefit as a consequence of a change in legislation. And as the legislation changed, the people that would have received the medicine, obviously, that wasn't accessible to them, and yet there's this now open window of private clinics which are benefiting medically. So is that, like, what do you think conspiratorially wise? Is that forethought? Is that just good business planning? And how much of an impact does like Tate and Lyle have towards like the GW medical element in the UK? Just talking about UK, because obviously, personally, Steve, there's a global element. It seems to be that it's like almost like a fucking hidden hand which is inhibiting. Because if you've got one region of the globe which is kind of fast tracking, it just seems to all slow down. I don't know. It could just be my relatively small perspective on it. But starting in the UK, what do you interpret's been going on?
Okay, well, let's not talk conspiracy. Let's talk facts. So I'll split it into two questions. So I'm going to talk about GW, not technology, GW, formerly GW, and the position there. So we know how much money they spent. We know they were involved with Reading University going back as far as 2015. And we know that with Reading University, they received more than £1 million worth of funding from GW. We know that there's been a bit of a revolving door with regard to academics working at GW. We know that at Reading University have contributed to the Committee on Toxicity, which is the UK Regulatory Advisory Committee that decided that CBD could only be administered up to 70 milligrams a day and needed to go through the novel food process. So that's a fact. We know that GW have influenced the Brazilian government and have exerted that influence through money and lobbying, and it's been proven to stymie the industry there. We know that GW are heavily lobbying the FDA in the States. We know that they have supplied limited and redacted evidence, and we know that they have made submissions to the FDA saying that if they were to allow CBD to be sold as a food supplement, it would undermine future investment in medicines, which would undermine the benefit to patients. So we know that's a fact. We know that if you look on the Committee on Toxicity meetings, which my name's on, I've been there as a guest, as an observer. You'll see GW had representatives there at the point they were making those decisions. We know that GW have refused to provide the data for all of their trials on Epidiolex to the Food Standards Agency, despite them requesting it. And we know that they continue to exert influence because, let's face it, they've invested all of this money and they are protecting their patents. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's any conspiracy there. I think what there is a clear blurring of the lines between what is good business practice, what's acceptable and lawful business practice, and the time at which you use your money and political influence to gain an unfair advantage. And I think that's where we're at. And I don't think it's a conspiracy at all. People talk about Theresa May and her husband. You know, there's an old phrase, it's good to be the king. I don't, you know, look, they did what they did, you know, they're still doing it now, you know, I mean, you know, nothing's changed. Nothing ever will change. That's what happens if you're the king or the queen, or well, maybe not the queen. She was a good girl. God rest her soul. but that's what you do. Look at Prince Andrew. I'm not putting GW in the same bracket as Prince Andrew, but you know, people get I'm surprised people are surprised by it. What I'm more surprised about is how uncomfortable some of the regulators and the position in the UK are now that it's been pointed out to them, and that's you know, so transparent. Your question about, I mean, topping that, you know, I mean, you know, Deloitte's great firm. They've just been appointed to do this review of novel foods by the FSA. And there's a little bit of confusion about when that was advertised, and let's say that's all fine. But you know, regulated products, as it's called now by the UK, not novel foods. Deloitte's are reviewing that. Now, I know anyone can show CBD makes up 80% of the regulated products applications. Now, I'd sound a bit of an arsehole if I said I'm annoyed they haven't come to speak to me. But you know, Matt and I have a huge amount of experience, but been highly critical. Why would you want to come and talk to us about it?
Yeah.
But you think you'd have to go and talk to someone, but they haven't been to talk to the ACI, because they told everybody, you know. I mean, they spin more than a spinning top. They haven't spoken to the CIC. They haven't spoken to the CTA, who at least have been honest about that, and they haven't spoken to them. So who are they speaking to? So that's not a review. So that, again, I said it before, I think that's the FSA getting their mum to mark their homework. And there's a history of Deloitte, you know. There's another revolving door. People going from the Food Standards Agency to Deloitte, and they get a lot of contracts. I imagine that's because they're really good at doing, and they understand it, but they seem to get a lot of these contracts, and then, you know, they're not cheap. And so again, that's not a conspiracy theory, because you've got to be careful, because in this world, if you say something that people don't like, the easiest way to dismiss you is to call you a conspiracy theorist. And people like Kevin Jones, you know, the hemp hound, shout out to him. He's not a conspiracy theorist. He actually spends a huge amount of time going through and demonstrating uncomfortable truths. So if you dismiss him as a tinfoil hat wearer, then no one takes account of his opinion, and that's wrong, because you know, these are
fucking well detailed, man. Kevin's brilliant. He's extremely knowledgeable about this stuff.
Yeah, I heard recently he's got the job of rewriting the St. James Bible. No, you know, there are certain things, Connor, that you have to put into context, and you just can't do it in a short number of words. Maybe a little bit short, but Kevin won't mind that. And then you talk about the private clinics. You know, I despise them, and I can't go into too much detail. But being a trustee of the Iron Billy Foundation and having so much contact with parents with children, seeing the inconsistent medicine, seeing the problems with dispensing, seeing the way these people are treated, it's just a race for money. And I'm not labelling them all like that. There are some really good people out there. You know, there are some good. Bod Australia is a great company selling a really good company. I think Canopy are doing all that they can to help. But there are people, and that's not an extensive list. So if I miss you, I really apologise. But I could give you examples now where people are misdescribing medicine. So we had Israeli medicine coming in, non-GMP. So what we got is, let's say we got a child or we got an adult, and a lot of these adults started off taking cannabis medicine when they were children illegally. But so they've been using this for a long period of time, and you finally get this ratio, and it can be the delivery mechanism. So whether you're mixing it with an MCT, the terpene blend, the cultivar, and it's working, and it's stopping the fits, or it's helping with the spasticity, you know, or the pain. And then if it was a drug, Connor, normal drug, and the drug company decided we're going to stop making that, you would be told, and you would have a period probably of a year, 18 months to find an alternative, and that would be discussed. That's not happening in these private clinics. They know that they've got 3 bottles of that on the shelf, and they're happy to prescribe it. And there's upselling taking place that I see. I'm aware of a consultant who's told the parents have got a prescription for Epidiolex off the NHS, so free Epidiolex, and they need the THC elements. They go to the private clinic and they're being told, unless you relinquish that NHS prescription and buy that CBD off us as well at a crazy price, we won't give you the THC. So, yeah, and I can give you lots of examples. I can show you mouldy medicine. I can show you medicine that's not fit for purpose. I've got photographs of medicine with bugs in it. And these are, some of these are innocent mistakes, okay? And we are dealing with biomass and we are dealing with a botanical product, and they're going to be variations. But there is an abject lack of care for the patient here, and there is an absolute concentration on revenue generation. And what some of these fools don't realise is the MHRA aren't stupid, NICE aren't stupid, you know, the British Medical BMA, those people that they're constantly saying are to blame are not the ones who are, and they're aware of these issues, because parents who are desperate call them up and send them the photos and show them the medicine. And there is a distinct suspicion. And one of the reasons that we're not moving forward to NHS wider prescription is not because of a stigma, and not because of these people who've taken the Hippocratic Oath, and the vast majority of doctors, consultants are good and inherently good people, and at the core of their being is to try and help people. So they're not doing this because they don't like cannabis. And they're the ones that are being criticised. And it's not that, it's because they have evidence that it's an inconsistent product. And they know that from their union, from their insurance, from their experience, that pharmaceutical drug may not be the miracle cure, but to a certain extent, as far as possible, they are comfortable that it has benefit and it's not going to do harm. What they don't know is, if they give a bottle 1 week and it's well produced, it works, that the bottle they give the next month isn't going to be. And you can't tell me if a bottle of cannabis oil's got a bug in it, or nearly a bug in it, that is something that you should be blaming the NHS for. So we've got a responsibility, you know. I speak to a lot of healthcare professionals who are sold on this, and we've seen trials, and there's money there. There is money there as well to conduct these trials, and the government has allocated funds, but there are stipulations. You've got to be able to produce a consistent product, and if you can't, and often you can't, because the driver for your business is not production of medicine, it's mass production of private prescription high THC shit, which you or I will go in, pay our 300 quid, and we think, oh, that bud's a bit shit this month, but we're still smoking it. They're not going to produce a separate cultivar because it doesn't make commercial sense. So the people that really deserve this medicine, the people that have put us all in the position we are, because let's be honest about this, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation if there wasn't a sea change in 2018 because of Charlotte and Billy and the other children, you know, and that's why we're here. But they are acutely aware that there is a large number of people that are trying to hijack that change to legitimise cannabis smoking, and that's why I think we should divorce it. And one other thing I want to say, you know, there are a number of mothers and fathers with very poorly children in the press. I don't criticise any of them. I think you should be able to use whichever means possible to try and ensure the safety of your child. So I never have any criticism for parents. I have a huge amount of criticism and disdain and disgust for some of the people that try and capitalise that publicity for their own gain. But that's probably another chat.
Essentially, Steve, so before we get going, man, what do you see happening in the UK in the next 18 months to 2 years? What do you think would be best? And for people that are exclusively adult use consumers, you know, is there hope? Is there a scenario where it's going to be fruitful? I remember I watched one of your interviews online when you were at Malta, and you'd said that there is no utopia, there's only learning from mistakes. You know, so I mean, what do you see happening in the next 18 months, and what's the best direction?
Well, if we're talking about legalisation, where do I stand? The current situation cannot prevail. It's causing, as I said, I keep repeating it because I think the terminology and the narrative is so important. It's social harm. Let's not talk about a war on drugs. The black market controlling the supply of cannabis is causing harm, and that's undoubted. So we need to change it. How do we do it? Decriminalisation is not the way forward. You highlighted a very, very important point, which is, where does the supply come from? And I guess in my argument, that's the kind of the link. But I've thought about this. So if we want to allow, we need to have a period of time where we can put in place an infrastructure which allows for UK cultivation or supply of cannabis that meets an as yet undescribed specification from a safety perspective, whether it be described as as a food or a supplement. And it's probably going to have to go then. And we're not sure which department would even be suitable to handle this, but that's easy enough to sort. So how do we sort that? How do we sort that period of time? Well, we do have people at the moment who are cultivating medicinal cannabis to GMP standards. And because of the failures of the companies in Canada and North America, that the price of GMP cannabis was being flawed. We had Tilray coming in about 4 years ago trying to offer capitalize the German market at 1.73 euros. So we actually do have that cultivation. So if I was going to solve this problem, I would say there is a demand for people to smoke cannabis. The cannabis club model works. It needs a supply. It doesn't work in Amsterdam because of the black market. So what we do is we have a license in place for somebody to create an area where people can use cannabis, purchase and use cannabis. And we apply criteria. There's no alcohol in there. I think that would have to be there. Obviously, you over 18 or 21, let the government decide. It would be via membership. And the supply would be from a current medicinal cultivator who has a surplus of products that they can't sell. And that could be in the form of oils, edibles, or flour. So the government would be able to tax that. And I don't want them to tax it overly, but they'd be able to tax that. There'd be VAT on that. And they could have a standalone tax on the sale of recreational cannabis. And then that would go to a secure distribution centre, such as the existing dispensaries and pharmacies, because that infrastructure is in place. And then a cannabis club would order its cannabis. You'd have to have responsible individuals. They would have a safe room or gun cabinets. I mean, if Christ almighty, if you can store a shotgun, in a gun cabinet, surely you can store a bit of weed. And it always bothers me that the police, the Home Office, are so worried about cannabis getting stolen. Christ, if you're running a cannabis business, you kind of want to make sure no one's going to nick your stuff.
Yeah.
It can be responsible. So I think you can have that supply. And I think it begins at the cannabis club level with that supply. And I think you then have to decide whether or not people can buy cannabis from a dispensary, and what the criteria are. So that cannabis is still coming from a licensed medicinal producer of cannabis. But if you go to Delaware and you go into the dispensary there and you register with your passport and you've got a lovely Chesterfield, you sit down, they call you up, you pick your Hindu Kush and they say, is it medicinal or recreational? And if it's medicinal, you go to that till and you get charged $30 left. If it's recreational, you go to that till. There's no difference. So you can do that, you can learn from the mistakes. So I think we could have a situation where you say, yeah, people can smoke their own home. Look, I don't care if they say if you've got children under the 18, you're not allowed to smoke cannabis. People might not like that. Baby steps. Let's give them something they're comfortable with. So let's start with an area. Let's start with a cannabis club. Let's start with a supply that they're already comfortable with, which they control, which is licensed, which the police are comfortable with. Let's work out on a secure courier. That's easy to do. And let's allow them to place a levy on it. That then gives us the opportunity. Could be a pilot. Let's do that for 18 months. And let's see whether black market crime, social harm diminishes. There's the justification to go, okay, we don't necessarily need. I honestly think, to be honest with you, these medical companies will no longer be supplying medical cannabis because there won't be the need for it. We'll end up with a very small niche. And hopefully someone's going to take up the mantle. And that's where I think we need this additional tax. It only has to be 1%, but that goes into clinical research for actual, cannabis medicinal pharmaceutical applications outside of pharmaceutical companies. So I think that works. I think that model works. I think we protect vulnerable groups. I think the government's happy because it's controlled, and I think you could choose. I think there would be a lot of these clubs. I mean, there are a lot of cinemas shutting down. There are a huge amount of pubs shutting down. A lot of people losing their jobs. You could get a lease on a pub. Pubs have safes. Pubs don't like people breaking in and stealing their spirits and their bashing your fruit machines. There's an infrastructure available. There's an opportunity. It generates revenue, creates jobs, and it's secure. Do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't, Connor. Because unfortunately, a number of reasons. Firstly, it would take a lot of us to get together and formulate that, to present that as a realistic model. But I actually think there'd be a huge amount of resistance from within our own industry, because there are too many people making too much money out of private prescriptions.
Right.
Because you will not be paying that amount of money when you go to a cannabis club. And purveyors of cannabis will not stand for crap and poor quality. And I think we probably need to sort our own house out, and that's all of us, and be honest, a little bit more honest, very honest in some cases, and decide what we actually want to achieve. And that's why I think we need to separate it. We need the CBD industry. We need push pharmaceutical to one side at the moment. I think we need to embrace the NHS. We need to find a place for what I call the true non-pharmaceutical medical. And I think the rest of us come together. And whether you're going to self-medicate or not, I don't think it matters, as long as you're in a safe environment. And if there's a jukebox in one, you might go to one where it's a bloody roller disco. I don't know. People choose where they want to spend their money. Yeah. But I don't see a risk there. I think we have a lawful supply. And I think you'd find more people applying to cultivate in the UK. We could be an area of expertise. We could set the standard for analytical work. It would allow people to look at heirlooms and look at heritage. I just think it creates so many opportunities. But I think when you brand it as saying this is the new Scotch whiskey, I think when you say I've got a right to do it, I don't disagree with any of those. I just don't think it achieves the aims. But I think there's a model there with cannabis clubs, controlled environment, and being able to say to the government, look, you're already issuing the license. You know this is, you know where the money comes from. There's no money laundering here. There's no bad money coming in. It's private investment. You're happy that it's pharmaceutical grade, and you're happy with the conditions. You've got a transport system in place. You've got a club run by professional people. You've got the ability to look after the patrons, and you can control that. And I suspect if that was formulated, I think that's an option that they could. It might be a pilot, but I think that would work.
It sounds promising. And to be honest, the thing where you hear it constantly in the cannabis world, where it's 5 years, 5 more years now. That it's fingers crossed it's within 5 years.
I think it's more likely to be decriminalisation on a force by force basis. We already see it. Some constabularies, as I said before, don't arrest people. Others tolerate, others do. But yeah, I mean that's a model I think that would work, and I think it's worth pursuing.
Yeah, nice one, Steve. Well, let's say this has been extremely informative and an absolute pleasure. Are you wanting to say anything before we get going?
No, good luck with the film. I think what I'd like to say is that you might see Connor on social media and think he's a cartoonist. He's anything but. Scratch the surface. Have a read of his book, and I look forward to talking to you again, Connor.
Thanks to Steve for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoy the content. I'll see you next time.